I am delighted to turn this over to Chaz Miller, who is our guest speaker today. And he is going to be speaking with us about recycling markets. So Chaz is the CEO of Chaz Miller Associates. He is a 40-year veteran of the recycling and waste industry. And he's an ex officio member of the Northeast Recycling Council Board of Directors and is the primary author of the NRRA reports on increases in Northeast American domestic recycled paper and recycled plastic capacity. So he is well tuned into changes in those markets. He's also the chair of the Montgomery, Maryland Aiming for Zero Waste Task Force. And as I said, Chaz is going to be talking with us today about current recycling markets and possible future markets, because everyone wants to know what's coming next. We are going to cover those questions that were submitted in advance as people registered, and then we'll also cover other audience questions as time allows. So thank you very much for joining us, Chaz. And Heather, it has your presentation up.
And I am now unmuted. And I'm delighted to be here, and my congratulations to the NRRA on 40 years. That is an amazing, it's an amazing achievement in recycling for a state or regional organization to stay active, stay in operation, and be so successful over 4 decades. And I congratulate all the members, Reagan, the staff, previous board members for making this happen and surviving all these years through the ups and downs of recycling markets. And, you know, talk about the ups and downs for the last 3 years when I talk about recycling markets, I've been Donnie Downer. I've been depressing everybody. Wasn't that bad in spring. Now I'm cheerful Chaz, and it's a lot more fun to have good things to say about markets than bad things. I do welcome your questions. A copy, a PDF of my slides and my speaker notes will be available after the presentation, so you don't have to take a whole lot of copious notes. I'm going to start with prices, and then I'm going to look at why they are better and what we're looking at in the next 6 to 12 to 18 months. So the next slide, please. This is my standard kickoff slide. It's a reminder. These are just raw materials looking for buyers. They're commodities. Their prices fluctuate. And buyers, recyclables, they are not getting some reverb. Do we still have the reverb? Okay, good, thank you. Buyers want reliable quantity, they want reliable quality, and they want to pay what to them will be an acceptable price. And in these times of good prices, we forget that to our peril. Next slide, please. I'm going to start off with price because I think that's what we want to talk about, and then why prices are so good now. I'm going to be using recyclingmarkets.net. It's published monthly in Resource Recycling magazine, and you can get a subscription for a price. So it's a reasonable price. The numbers seem to track out with other people that I talk to who are selling recyclables. So I think basically they're good numbers. I'm going to start with paper, with OCC, old corrugated containers, and RMP, residential mixed paper. So the next slide, please. Hey, how can you beat $172.50 for OCC per ton and almost $100 for residential mixed paper? OCC, 5 times better than it was 2 years ago, 3 times better than it was a year ago. RMP, even more dramatic explosion in price. It's worth noting OCC is down a little bit. It went down $8.50 just in the latest pricing. Northeast is fortunate. You're about $10 above national prices, which is a nice benefit. Residential mixed paper did not really go down. It's been at the same price. It's sort of taking advantage of a gap in supply for OCC as a fill-in for facilities that can use it, because they're simply not getting enough clean OCC. Most important is that spread between the price of OCC and the price of RMP. It's like $75 now. At $75 a ton, you can more than afford to pull out the OCC and sell that separately instead of selling that as RMP. You can't get it all, but the more you can get, the better off you are. The next slide, please. Let's look at plastics. I'm going to start with the two HDPEs. Again, you see that increase over the last 2 years for both natural and for colored. At the same time, they both sagged a little bit in the last 2 months. Natural HDPE is down 19 cents since last month. On the other hand, it's up 15 cents over the beginning of the year. Colored HDPE is down about 18 cents from its high, but it's also up. In its case, it's up 21 cents since the beginning of the year. And both are slightly above the national average here in the Northeast. And natural HDPE, it's so versatile. And because it's natural, brands can buy it. They can use it for detergent bottles, for shampoo, for anything that does not require food contact, meeting food contact requirements. And that gives natural a very nice edge. Colored HDPE is really benefiting off of good construction markets. Next slide, please. And we look at PET beverages and we look at polypropylene. You also see prices going down a little bit. PET is down about 8 cents since it peaked in early September, but it's still up considerably over 2 years ago, and even more so over last year. It's still up 12 cents or so since last year. And polypropylene, it's definitely gone down from its high. I think that one went a little too crazier than most of them, candidly. But again, the prices are so much better than they were 2 years ago, and they were at the beginning of they were a year ago. It's down 15 cents from its high, but it's still up 13.5 cents from the beginning of the year. Next slide. And metals, hey, these ones are not softening. They're maintaining their prices they've had for the last several months. Aluminum, up dramatically over the last 2 years. Steel, a stunning rebound. You got a lot of demand for both of these. Demand, semiconductor chips, automobiles, construction. For steel cans, 70% of US production capacity is electric arc furnace. And that uses scrap of all different kinds. And it's worth noting now, aluminum for years was the most valuable item in the waste stream because of that very high value. It's got surpassed by natural HDPE a couple of months ago. I think aluminum may be on a trend to regaining its #1 status. The next slide, please. And you see this in what we're hearing from MRFs and what we're hearing from haulers in regarding to the recycling revenues. NRRA does a report on the average value of a ton at a MRF in the Northeast. 175, including the value of managing the residue, a little bit under 185 without that cost of residue. That's up more than 40% for each in the previous quarter. That's more than 3 times as high as it was a year ago. This is a tremendous example of the stunning rebound in value and prices. And the hauling and recycling companies in their third quarter earnings reports, they're noting that recycling revenues are a tailwind, not a headwind. They're not complaining about recycling these days. Republic Services, which I think is the only company that gives an average price per ton, $230 per ton for a ton of recyclables versus $99 a year ago. Now, it is worth noting that includes a lot of corrugated from commercial sources. That includes certain specialty grades they will be collecting that you will not be collecting at the curbside, but it still is an incredible example of the increase in value here. Next slide, please. And the reason for this is simple. Demand is far greater than supply. And this is a total reversal of the last 3 years, but it's also sort of testimony to the reality that recyclables are bought, they are not sold, and that buyers' demand is so strong right now. And I know that many of us were predicting better prices at the end in this year. I don't know anybody who predicted prices this dramatically strong. And I want to make a little aside here. It would be nice if the press started acknowledging this. And why aren't the environmental groups and the national recycling groups acknowledging this? My congratulations to Reagan and NRRA for the op-ed. I know it appeared in the Concord paper and I think one or two others. NRRA has been pushing this. SWANA came out with an excellent report on the increase of the value of recyclables. But as of today, I've only seen one report in the national press about better markets, and that was in the Wall Street Journal about PET, and it was yesterday. I'm very frustrated about, but that's one of my two cranky old man rants that you're going to hear during this presentation. Next slide, please. I want to talk about what's causing this strong demand, and it's a number of factors. For both paper and plastics, you've got new domestic capacity, exports remain strong, you've got very high virgin raw material prices, and you've got a shortage of supply. For paper, you have that issue of e-commerce needing more boxes and smaller boxes. And plastics, you've got simply the demand spurred by recycled content commitments. And I want to go through all of these and look at how they played out. Let's start with the domestic capacity. Next slide. Next slide, please. This is the new Pratt paper mill in Wapakoneta, Ohio. Actually opened a year ago. It's now streaming towards full production. This is what we're seeing in paper. Next slide, please. At NRRA, we've been tracking the increase in recycled content capacity in North America for about 3 years now. We've identified 32 announcements. 15 of those facilities have been completed. In terms of using OCC in residential mixed paper, 12 of the 15 are expansions of existing OCC linerboard capacity, and three of them are two of them are new facilities that rely heavily on residential mixed paper. And there's also some conversions in there in the OCC where a mill that used to make printed paper is now being converted to make packaging paper. Rumford, Maine is a great example of that. Those OCC expansions also include 3 mills that are also, as part of their conversions or expansions, are also making recycled fiber pulp, which is very, very new. It's being shipped to China in lieu of shipping bales of paper. They're shipping pulp. It's kind of an odd experiment, but it seems to be working right now. And 3 of those mills now have machines producing that pulp. There's also a food contaminated paper mill that opened in Toledo, Ohio, on Georgia Pacific. And they're looking at taking waste from restaurants, pulling out the paper fiber, turning it into a liner board, and then finding other uses for the organics and the other material in the stream. It's a fascinating experiment, and they're looking at siting this in the East Coast. Now, not all of these facilities will be built. We simply don't need that much new box capacity. The expansions will be finished. There's 4 of those left. They'll be finished by the end of this, sometime next year. Won't see all the new mills, but when this is all said and done, you're talking at least 6 million tons of new capacity, about half of which is already online. Next slide, please. On plastic, it's the same basically good story. There's 30 new processing facilities announced. More than 10 of those are open. Most of them make resin, which is then sold to various end markets to make new plastic products. Some actually make end products such as plastic lumber. Again, there's no guarantees all will be built. The data on this is a bit old. It will be updated by the end of the year. For plastics, there's a particular issue of supply. And, you know, recently a PET processor in California had said very bluntly, hey, you can do all the recycled content requirements you want. The recycling industry has a hard limit on the available feedstock of material, on how much people will recycle. And I thought that was an interesting comment, especially coming out of California. Next slide, please. Let's talk about exports. And I guess this is sort of what exports feel like these days. They're moving rather slowly. And we know about the problems. We know there's shortages in trucks to get bales to docks. We notice that there's shortages in shipping containers. We know there's shortages in sailings. We know there's problems at ports. Boston is probably, ironically, the only port in the Northeast that's having a problem. Clearly out in California, Savannah, there's serious port problems. And those will not clear up for 6, 12, maybe even 18 months. It's an issue of capacity, and it's an issue of other aspects of that business. But the reality is, even though we export less tons than we have done, we are still exporting a substantial amount of recyclables, and those markets are helping keep prices where they are. Next slide, please. Let's look at paper. 16 million tons of paper were exported last year. That's down 5 million tons from 2018, but we still export 1/3 of the paper we collect for recycling. You look at the data for the first 6 months, we're at a pace for 9 million tons. I have not yet seen data through the third quarter. It should be out shortly. My guess, we're not going to be at the same pace because of the export issues, but exports for paper still at the end of the year will run definitely above where they were in 2020. And the major markets, India, Mexico, Vietnam, right there you have more than half the exports. Next slide, please. For plastic also, you see exporting, it's down considerably from 2017, down by less than half of what was done in 2017 was exported in 2020. But again, you look at 2021, the first 6 months, it's the same level of exports. And interestingly enough, 43% of the plastics we export for recycling go to Canada or Mexico. You throw in Malaysia and you're up at about 62%. So we have a much better amount going just to our immediate neighbors for plastic than we do for paper. And there's just an interesting issue, and I think it kind of messes up the discussion of plastic exports. We measure plastic exports by billions of pounds, whereas we measure paper exports by millions of tons. And that's sort of like comparing raisins and watermelons. It's just a lousy comparison. We export maybe 6%, in terms of plastics, maybe the equivalent of 6 or 7% of the paper we export, an even smaller percentage of the metals. So it's a very emotional issue. I understand all those. I have no problem with them. But in some ways, we've blown that issue out of proportion. Next slide, please. I want to look at recycled content commitments and how they've driven these markets and this market demand. I want to start with paper. Well, heck, for paper, it's already routine. Globally, 55% of the raw materials used to make new paper products come from recycled content. It's a totally different business. It's a well-established, it's just a business. It's just part of the operations of the paper industry internationally. And if you look at the history of recycled content in this country, it's primarily paper, and it's primarily newspapers. 14 states in the mid-90s passed laws requiring certain levels of recycled content newsprint when printing newspapers. They did not have a supply problem then. The publishers had no particular objection. Of course, they had problems over some of the specifics, but they were very comfortable at that point with using recycled newsprint. The technological issues had been resolved, but they did not change the impact of commodity markets. They still were a reality for the value of ONP, nor did it decouple the price of paper from that of virgin raw materials. And I sort of mentioned that because now we see a lot of interest in plastic minimum content, and you can go ahead and change the slide. But they're different, and we've got to remember that paper and plastic and metals and glass are all different products, and you can't just assume they're all the same and react the same way. Let's look at plastic. Many brands are committed to using more plastic recycled content, usually 2025, 2030 goals. Natural HDPE has benefited tremendously from that. PET less so, but then in PET, you have this interesting variable. The biggest market for PET remains the fiber industry, carpets and clothing. They can pay more than the bottle industry can. They've got a more valuable end product. So how do you work in recycled content when you've got that marketing variable? And how serious are these commitments? I really don't care about 2025 goals. I care about 2021 goals. I care if the CEO's financial compensation depends in part, and that bonus package, on meeting the 2021 recycler content goal. I care if procurement agents can pay more. And I would point out, if you look at the very few existing minimum content laws for plastic, got them for garbage bags in California, but they're not enforced. You've got them for beverage bottles now starting in 2022 in California at 15%. And I think it's not going to be a problem in California, but then California has a deposit law. It's very easy for the bottlers to get those plastic bottles back. Although ironically, even in California right now, they're exporting PET bales to Mexico because the market pays better than it pays in California. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out in California next year when the new law comes into effect. And there's also going to be the issue of inflation. As we deal with inflation in the economy and as raw material prices get more expensive, how is this going to play out? Next slide, please. So let's have some predictions from Mr. Wizard. You might note I was a bit off about the Cubs. They didn't make it to the World Series till 2016, but they did win the World Series. So the track record is a little flawed, but it still works in a way. I think this era of good markets, it's got staying power. Yes, the prices are softening, totally inevitable. You've got a lot of variables on the pricing, one of which is simply seasons. But they should remain strong for a while. Demand will continue to outpace supply, and that's a problem we've got to work on resolving. Because if the supply, especially on plastics, cannot keep up with the demand, you're going to see some weakness, further slide in those prices. We've got to be much more serious in how we approach supply. We've got to get away from theory. We've got to focus on facts. And we've got to accept that supply is not just about policy. It is about people and getting people to recycle. Next slide, please. And it's worth noting that Europe itself is failing to meet its plastic recycling goals in spite of all of the policy they put into place. So for paper, prices will soften. It's normal in the winter as facilities shut down machines for maintenance and orders slow down. They've made already by now, they made the boxes they need for holiday shopping. You just don't need as many boxes made in December and January. The industry always slows down. And there's another thing, and that's in the third quarter. Mills were in such a panic over supply, they drove up prices as they bought more and more. They've got plenty of inventory. They've got 35,000 tons more inventory now than they did in the previous quarter. And that's significant. I don't see a major drop. Virgin prices for pulp remain high. Linerboard companies have increased prices twice this year. But again, you're running into that inflationary issue. In the third quarter, interestingly enough, the linerboard companies predicted flat or increasing OCC prices. I think they were caught a little bit by surprise by the current softening. Normally that happens in December, not in November. And I think I noted this earlier, waste and recycling companies are noting tailwinds, not headwinds from recycling. They're making good money off of recycling. And even Sims, in its most recent report, was just very bullish about what recycling is doing for them. And while their MRF on Long Island, or I'm sorry, the MRF on Staten Island is by far not the only thing they do, I'm sure it benefited too. Two big questions. Where will e-commerce land in export? E-commerce has been great in terms of demand for corrugated boxes. But as a percentage of retail sales, it has actually declined from its all-time high a year ago in the third quarter. And that's because stores have reopened and the percentage of sales that's not online has increased even more than the percentage of sales online. So I think it's going to be good. And somebody asked a question, what is linerboard? That's a great question. Linerboard is the inside and the outside of a box. And then between those two boards, you have that fluted medium. That's called corrugated medium. Corrugated medium has always been fairly high in recycled content. Now what we're seeing is linerboard is starting to have recycled content too, and it's still meeting the strength requirements needed for corrugated boxes so your products arrive safe. As for export, who knows? I don't know how quickly the port problem is going to play itself out. And there's one really big problem on markets for paper, and it's quality. The export markets are very picky. They do a lot of residential mixed paper. They're not happy with some of the stuff they're starting to see in the bales of residential mixed. I think that's a big problem facing export. We've got to stay on top of quality. I sat in on a session 2 weeks ago specifically about paper markets from mill buyers, and they were all complaining about the quality of residential mixed paper. So double down on those efforts to make sure your quality is good, because good sellers are always remembered by buyers, because it is such a relational industry. Next slide, please. Plastics, much harder to predict. Clearly, prices are softening right down. I think more than any of us anticipated, candidly. Long term, oil price is still rising. Brent crude is at 84 a barrel now. It's more than double where it was a year ago. That means virgin resin prices are going up. PE production is still not recovered from the polyethylene, your basic component of most plastic packaging. It's not recovered from the Texas freeze or from the 2 hurricanes. And that's also delayed the opening of some new virgin resin facilities that are online to come online in Texas and Louisiana. That's helping, frankly. But that production issue will fix itself barring another freeze or hurricane. Brand demand, is it real? Is it PR? I think it's real, but I also think brands are saying we can't afford to pay this anymore. We've met our quotas for 2021. We've got to slow back and look at what we're paying for our raw materials. We may have hit that kind of price point where they can't eat the price and the difference anymore. But basically, next slide. Hey, good prices are here to stay, at least for a while. There's a lot to be happy about. I call these Goldilocks markets. Prices aren't too hot, they aren't too cold. People aren't stealing stuff from the curbside, although ironically, I did hear that is happening in at least one part of Pennsylvania right now. But don't make a mess of them. We can't get greedy or giddy over these markets. You got to come back to earth at some point. It's sort of a mantra of mine. Markets come and go, but quality is eternal. You have to do that quality, or you'll just sour your relationships with your buyers. You got to plan for the long term, because that's the nature of recycling and commodity markets. And what I want to do is I want to finish with some thoughts specifically about paper and plastic. It's based on a column that I wrote last month for Waste 360 that answered a question raised at a US Senate hearing on recycling and the circular economy. And the question, and interestingly, was raised by 2 separate senators, one from each party. Why is paper recycling easier than plastic recycling? Because that's got a lot of implications for markets. Next slide, please. Let's look at paper. Well, 62% of paper products made in this country are packaging, and almost all of those are boxes. Another 24% is printed paper. Those are both incredibly easy to recycle, and everybody knows exactly what a box is. I'm sorry, that's an easy test. Everybody knows what a sheet of paper is. 2/3 of the MSW we collect for recycling at the curbside, nationally, is paper. And most of that is commercial paper from OCC, more than half, because those stores have tremendous financial advantages in selling their corrugated boxes instead of paying to have them disposed of. 60%, maybe 65% of residential recyclables are paper by weight, but the quantity and the quality is not as reliable, and we don't have that financial incentive those stores do. But paper recycling is a well-established business worldwide. When you sit in on these conversations between mill buyers or company representatives. They're talking about simply recycled paper as part of their business and what the economic conditions are and what the business conditions are. They rarely, if ever, talk about policy. It's simply about supply and demand and how they are balancing out and the impact of that demand and supply on markets. Next slide, please. With plastic, only 41% of the plastic made is packaging. Almost 60% is either durable products such as computers, desks, utensils, you name it, furniture. And in that packaging, there's a wide variety of resins and types. It's hard to differentiate PET. Well, you can differentiate natural from colored HDPE. That's kind of easy, but it's hard to differentiate the others. And plastic is only 4.5% of MSW product recycling by weight. And most of that is residential, for which you have very few financial incentives. And it's a small percentage of residential recyclables by weight. The only significant commercial recycling is for plastics is film coming off of stuff wrapped, loads of material going to loading docks. And it's film that's used to wrap all those boxes together and keep them on the pallet. And plastic recycling is, it's an immature business worldwide. It does not have the long life. It does not have the strength of the paper business. And they talk a lot about policy when they talk about markets, while they're sort of bewailing the supply issues. Next slide. But I want to leave you with this image. Think of curbside recycling markets like this slice of cake. Paper is the body of that cake. Plastic is the icing. Paper is where you get your bulk. It's where you meet your tonnage. And let's face it, goals are driven by tonnage. Plastic is the icing. On a per unit basis, plastics have virtually no value. I mean, who cares about the value of an empty PET bottle? It's meaningless. On a per ton basis, we're talking serious money. Every single plastic resin I mentioned is more valuable on a tonnage basis than either OCC or residential mixed. And that's why I think of plastic as the icing on the cake. There's not a lot of there in weight, but there's a lot of value in what it brings. The calorie count is higher, if you will. And I think that's got a lot of implications for recycling markets and policies that we really don't talk about at all. I don't have the answers, but I think we need to start figuring them out. But nonetheless, on this 40th anniversary of NRRA, enjoy your cake. Every single bite of it, and enjoy those markets. So you want to finish up with my last two slides. These are just my contact information. And then the other slide is simply just some resources for y'all to use when you're looking at this. And I'm happy to throw this open to questions now. There is a question about aspects of quality in the mixed paper are a problem for exporting. Hey, it's the stuff that's not mixed paper. It's the failure to sort out the prohibitives adequately, and even more so to throw out the outthrows. If I got the two correct in my mind, I sometimes confuse them. But it's the stuff that you can't make paper out of, whether it's bottles or just dirt or broken glass or what have you. And the unfortunate reality is there are recyclers who get sloppy when markets are good. They take advantage of good markets. And that's the problem with exports, because those export markets for residential mix, by their very nature, they don't have the technology to deal with truly dirty bales. It's not as sophisticated as what you find in the Chinese mills or what you find in American or Canadian or Mexican mills. So that's why that becomes a bigger problem for them.
Chaz, thank you so much. It's great to learn not just what the markets are doing now and sort of predictions for the future, but also why. I think that's just hugely helpful. And you mentioned that things are looking to soften a bit. I mean, we already have a draft of our November pricing guide, and we're seeing fibers down, $10 a ton for November, as expected. I will mention briefly that I happened to meet a senior person at the New Hampshire Public Radio recently at a gathering. And I definitely gave that person an earful about how the media has been more than happy to share the news of the handful of communities who stopped recycling in New Hampshire a few years ago. And yet they're not covering the great markets now. And so I pitched a story to them and they're considering it. But it's just, bad news sells. It's the truth.
It is.
But getting on to some questions, we had some questions submitted in advance that I want to cover. I think you did a good job of talking about what you feel is coming down the pike for fibers markets, and that was two of our questions that came in. Someone also asked, should we expect to see regional market variations increase for different areas of the country? I think I've heard you say before, that the Northeast tends to have slightly higher pricing than other places, but do you see other variations by region coming up in our future?
Yes, the more dependent you are on exports, hint, California in particular, the more you're going to see problems. California, it's criminal. 15 paper mills closed in California that use recycled fiber content since 2002. No new capacity has been built in California. I mean, so they got problems. They got serious problems. But the rest of the country, and it was interesting in the session that I saw 2 weeks ago was the paper and plastic recycling conference, which was all online this year. And for whatever reason was free. So hell, I took advantage of it. And but asked the mill buyers, what's the most important thing when you're buying paper? And all four of them said quantity and quality have to be reliable. One or two of them are very specific. The closer the mill, the closer the buyer, the happier, the closer the seller, the happier we are. We want it as close as possible. And that's what they're looking for. They're trying to keep their transportation costs down. And I think they also see that as a wedge against exports. Now,
right.
In Maryland, it's child's play to get to the Port of Baltimore. And the Port of Baltimore does not have a shipping problem, knock on wood. But that's not the rest of the country. That's just our unique little local advantage.
Well, and you've hinted on this, but another of the questions that came in advance was, do you foresee any changes in the requirements of our recycling materials as we all, strive to achieve the best revenues where possible? What changes are expected in the future? And I am going to go out on a limb and say, I think, as you already said, the emphasis on quality. If you have quality material, we can always find a home for it.
There is an interesting ringer out there. That's the so-called chemical or advanced or simply non-mechanical plastic recycling. Some of those processes do work. Eastman down in Tennessee does seem to work very well. Most of them are lab successful, but not commercial scale successful yet. Some have floundered for more than a decade. If those processes work, then depending on their quality requirements, that could be very good. But to me, that's two big ifs. That's going to take, I think, 4 to 5 years to truly separate the hype from the operating reality. And you still have the supply issue, which has to be resolved.
And then the last question that came in advance that I'll put to you to cover is, if your municipality is planning to invest in new recycling capabilities, what advice would you give based on which commodities are likely to have sustained value in the coming years? Are there any no regrets investments that a municipality should consider?
I'm only laughing because I call it Paleozoic MRF that we have in my home county in Montgomery County, Maryland, which was built in 2000. And if you walk into it, you know it immediately, is finally being replaced. So we're grappling with that issue. I think what you have to do is you have to design your MRF for flexibility in changing the technology you may be using. We are in the midst of an unprecedented transformation in the technology at MRFs. MRFs that were built 5 years ago are kind of old. MRFs like the one in my county that were built 21 years ago are Social Security beyond. They're older than I am in dog years. You've got to have flexibility to install new equipment. You have to have flexibility to be open to new equipment. You have to have the ability to stay on top of the advancements in artificial intelligence and robotic sorting in particular, because it's going to be stupid to say this, but I think they've got a lot of the stuff finished on optical sorting beyond just the basics of artificial intelligence. So it's that flexibility, I think, in the layout and the ability to easily substitute new equipment in place of old equipment is the key thing.
Okay. And then we have a question coming through about, well, if we're baling our mixed plastics right now, do we need to be separating? And we're not sure if we have enough room in our facility to do it. And that is sort of the classic challenge is, do you have space? There's ease of combining your plastics. There's a lot of factors to consider there.
Absolutely. And I think in particular in New Hampshire and Vermont, that's a much more challenging issue because you're going to be dealing with smaller facilities and a smaller footprint. Clearly where I live, it would be foolish not to pull out the 1s and 2s and 5s. But then we've got the footprint, we've got the space, and we've got 1 million people. So I don't have a good answer to that. I think if you've got the space and you can pull out at least the natural HDP, do it. Probably the same for the colored HDP, maybe for PET. It's that market variability. Patty Moore in the old Moore Recycling had some really good stuff about how value increases as you do more separation of the materials and get away from a purely mixed bale. And I don't think that basic data has changed 1 iota since they did it 4 or 5 years ago.
Okay. And I see we've got a few more questions than we'll be able to cover just to keep us on schedule today and to keep touch on everyone's time. But Chaz, maybe you'll be able to answer a few other questions afterwards that we can email out to folks. Would that be?
I'd be happy to.
Time for? Sure. So let's squeeze in one more if we can
Sure.
keep it brief. So this is a question about, thoughts on a 10% container deposit bill. We've got one that's being proposed in New Hampshire. I think one has been proposed in New Hampshire for many years. We've never gotten a bottle bill, but thoughts on bottle bills in general, perhaps?
There's really 2 answers to that. Number one, bottle bills clearly work at getting back bottles with the deposits on it, especially if the deposit is 10 cents or more. That data is undeniable. Secondly, deposits clearly have a negative impact on an existing MRF infrastructure. There's a noticeable difference in the MRFs in deposit states versus the MRFs in non-deposit states in terms of size, capacity, and technology. So if there's going to be a deposit in any state that does not have that, and they make no attempt to enable the existing MRF infrastructure to manage the gap in the change of its inflows, then shame on them. That's causing problems where you don't need to cause problems. So I think it has to be, you have to look at it holistically. You want to help recycling, you don't want to damage the existing infrastructure, you want to help that at the same time. That's doable. That can be done, but it just takes some willingness to do that and just sort of getting beyond cliches.
Thanks, Chaz. Yeah, it's a complicated one to do right.
Oh, yes.
Well, thank you very much, Chaz. That was fantastic. I really appreciate you sharing your expertise and time with us today. And now we're going to move on to our awards